All right. Hello, everybody from Zoom land. This is Andrew Hudson, and I'm so happy to have everyone here today. We have a full crowd here. It's great. This is such a important and popular topic. A few housekeeping things before we get started. Number one is we have been doing several of these seminars over the past week and a half, and they're all popular for different reasons. We have links to all of them on my Facebook page, and I will also email everybody here with that link. The videos are on my YouTube page. So if you've missed any of the seminars, they're still available, including this one will be available as well. We are also streaming this live on Facebook, so it will be on my Facebook page for a while as well. It's an important topic for a lot of reasons. I think number one is that we are in such unprecedented times right now. It's just beyond description. I mean, surreal doesn't even begin to describe it. And there's a lot of people that are finding themselves unemployed, furloughed, not certain about whether or not their work is going to be waiting for them when this all subsides. But even beyond the pandemic, I think one of the biggest issues that I get contacted about are from people who are in mid-career. They're over the age of 45, 50, into their 60s, and they're struggling trying to get traction in their job search. And there's a lot of different reasons for it. Some people have worked their butts off their entire career, and they've gotten to a certain level where, the jobs at that senior level are just not as prevalent in terms of what's available out there. There's not as many vice president jobs as there are coordinator jobs. There's not as many leadership positions. And if you've left your career, if you've been laid off for whatever reason, that can be a struggle. And then I hear from the job seekers who are saying, I don't want to be in positions of that responsibility anymore, and I'm happy to go back and do something that is a little bit more on the front lines, but they're struggling with that as well. And then again, I mean, the issues of ageism, which I'm not going to candy coat it, it exists, it's real. And how to deal with ageism, and what are the issues surrounding ageism. And so we have with us today an expert, and Janine Vanderburg is a good friend of our family's. She was my wife's former boss for many years and a mentor to Christine, and has done so much work in the nonprofit world. And I'm not going to take away all the glory. I want to have her talk more about her career and her progression, and even, quite frankly, her reinvention, which is also a big part of this as well. She's a former member of the Denver Commission on Aging. She received the Mayor's Diversity and Inclusion Award in 2018 for her work to address ageism. In 2019, she launched the Age-Friendly Workplace Initiative to reframe older workers to businesses and to make businesses more aware of the benefits of intergenerational workplaces. She brings over 3 decades of social sector leadership, strategic business planning, fundraising. She's a lawyer, she's a social entrepreneur, a community organizer, and right now she leads an organization called Changing the Narrative in Colorado, Ending Ageism Together, which is a campaign to change the way people think, talk, and act about aging and ageism. Many of you may have seen there was a big feature about a year ago with Janine in the Denver Post that really brought a lot of these issues to light, and brought them to light for employers, as well as, affirmed what a lot of older job seekers are going through right now. And so with that, Janine, I want to ask you, first off, say thank you very much for being here. This is just wonderful that you are here. I think you need to explain the backdrop before we get started, because I think people think you are actually in Belize.
I am not in Belize. I am not in Belize, but this is a picture on Ambergris Key in Belize, where I was in January. And using this backdrop does 2 things. It gives me hope about the post-COVID-19 economy, and I'm going to be able to go to the beach again. And secondly, and more pragmatically for this purpose and all the other Zoom webinars that we've been doing at Changing the Narrative, when the shelter-in-place order came in, I ended up with my daughter's 2 cats sheltering in my place. And what I've never had cats before, and what I've discovered is they have a tendency to just jump around. And so this sort of stops all of you seeing the antics of Jezebel and Simone. So anyway, that's the backdrop, but it's beliefs.
Well, it's fantastic. And the minute I saw that, I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot how much I missed the beach. So I hope I get to the beach as well. We were actually supposed to go to spring break in San Diego right before my wife got sick with the COVID.
Yeah.
And so we had to cancel that trip, but it wouldn't have been worth it anyway, because that week they started closing all the SeaWorld and Land and all that anyway. But
yeah.
Can you describe your own career and how you came to becoming an advocate for older Americans?
You bet. And before I do, so one, thank you, Andrew, for doing this whole series. It's amazing. And I've actually been following them all and getting them out to people. And I want to thank funders of Changing the Narrative, so Rose Community Foundation and Next 50 Initiative, who understood the importance in Colorado of portraying a different picture of older people and talking about ageism. And I also want to give a shout out to Karen Brown, who actually leads our age-friendly workplace initiative. So a lot of the work that we'll be talking about and sharing are a combination of my ideas and mostly Karen Brown's ideas. So Karen, if you're here, hi, thank you. So how I got here, this is probably, I don't know, my third Encore career. So I started out actually in Denver in 1980 as a Vista volunteer lawyer, working primarily in the Latino community, doing a lot of street law, helping people understand kind of their rights, et cetera. Practiced law for a while and discovered that it did not satisfy my needs and desires to promote social justice, and ended up starting JVA, where I met Christine, and who played such an important part in the evolution and growth of JVA, my former firm, now known as Joining Vision and Action. At JVA, worked on a lot of projects kind of about, and in some for Rose Community Foundation, on what would life look like for this coming generation of older adults, and primarily then we were looking at the boomer generation. And what happened in the the 2008-2009 Great Recession is that some friends of mine kept, as older people were being laid off, and that was, I think, the first time that we saw massive layoffs of people aged 50 and over, people kept recommending them to me and saying, can you help them? So somehow I became really interested in this idea about reinvention for older adults. So that's something I've had in mind for a long time, very consistent with what I've always believed in about potential of people of every age, any gender, any race, and that people ought to have opportunity. And I had a great role model. My mom grew up in an immigrant family that sent the boys to college and not the girls. And when she was 60, she looked at my dad and said, Ray, I'm going to college. And she graduated 4 years later, summa cum laude, and speaking 3 languages fluently. And I just thought, well, that's kind of what you do when you get older. So this current reinvention of leading, changing the narrative, basically, I was scheduled to leave JVA. Somebody called me and said, we want to do this campaign to end ageism. And I said, that sounds really interesting. So here I am.
Oh, that's fantastic. I know I've seen you speak on the issue, and for folks that are out there, you can contact Janine. Is it changingthenarrative.com? Is that where it is?
You know, I will type in my email because we're kind of a virtual organization, and I don't have it's Janine at Encore Roadmap.
Okay.
So if anyone wants to contact me, or they could go to the Changing the Narrative website, and if I can remember it, or I might ask Karen Brown, if you're on, and I see that you are, if you could type in the Changing the Narrative website, that would be fabulous.
Okay, so let's get into this. What are some of the ways we unintentionally create bias against older Americans? And is older Americans, I mean, what is the correct way? I was reading an article about different words that are
Yeah,
ways
so
to...
here are words that we don't want to say, and this is really, really important, and especially now in COVID-19, with all we're hearing it all the time, we don't want to use the word senior citizen, elderly, because the research shows that those terms are affiliated with all the stereotypes that are associated with us as we get older. So, older adults, older people, older Coloradans, older Americans, older workers, or that kind of thing. Or just being very neutral. I'm looking for, if I'm an employer and I'm smart, what I should be doing is looking for people who are age 55 and older who have certain kinds of experience. So, but using more neutral terms but definitely everybody. Hot tip, banish senior citizen, and elderly. Not only banish it from your own language and behavior, but when you hear people saying it, included public health officials and our elected officials, and that term seems to have experienced a resurgence in all the talk about COVID-19, just say, don't use those words.
Okay, now, so again, what are some of the unintentional ways that we create bias against folks?
So I think we have a lot of, so one of the things is research shows that ageism actually starts at a very young age, like, kids 3 and 4 already start distinguishing this younger versus older. It gets reinforced by things that we do as a society. So for example, there are school districts that do this kind of campaign to celebrate 100 years of school. They say, dress up like an old person, be frail, put powder on your hair, like gray, and that kind of thing. Use a cane, use a walker, and that kind of thing. So it's sort of encouraged along the way. Media contributes to it with anti-aging campaigns, right? The narrative is, right, that we all want to be younger, which is kind of ridiculous because when you think about it, the one thing that all of us in this webinar have in common is today for each one of us, it's the oldest we've ever been. Think about this before you go to sleep tonight, youngest you're ever going to be. And if we are fortunate, right, we are all going to wake up tomorrow, but a day older. So it's the one bias that we're all going to face at some point if we don't take action to stop it. But it's reinforced at all elements of society. A friend of mine posted something on social media the other day who said, in Africa, when an elder dies, they consider it like a library burning down. But we don't have that philosophy in the US. We have the, younger is better. And so it's reinforced along the way. And as we get older, we start internalizing it by saying things like, oh, I'm having a senior moment. Maybe I can't learn this new thing. Maybe I'm too old. And we need to just reject that in ourselves as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of these ridiculous claims, but in actually you bringing that up about the media and how we reinforce these things, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I hadn't thought about it, but think about the reverse mortgage ads on TV or all of the advertisements for medicine to help you when you're aging. I mean, you see that a lot more
right.
for older Americans and stuff. But then there's also this thing, over 85 years ago, Social Security is established, right, and the retirement age is 65 years old. And it's kind of like, that's the shelf life of somebody who is working, even though, and you can tell me, I just forget, they increased that age, right, for Social Security, didn't they?
Yeah, so it's kind of a sliding scale isn't the right term, but depending on the year you were born, it's 66 or 66 and 3 months, et cetera. But the bottom line is that normal retirement age was set in 1935 when Social Security was passed, a really important safety net. But think of the average longevity then. In 1935, the average longevity of men was 59, average longevity of women, 63. And we set normal retirement age, right, at 65. And that kind of continues and that language continues. Federal government has a term called prime working age, and prime working age is defined as between the ages of 25 and 54. Now think of how ridiculous that is given increased longevity, right? So we know Americans are living longer and healthier, for the most part, healthier lives. We know that average longevity at birth is likely to be in the late 70s. And if you've already turned 65, longevity is projected to be kind of in your mid to late 80s. So how ridiculous is it that we still are using the terminology and have the policies that say prime working age ends at age 54 and that normal retirement age is at 65? And those reinforce biases, throughout society and throughout companies. And it also doesn't make sense because we know the data isn't there. Before we went into the COVID-19 shutdowns, we know in Colorado, 1 in 4 people age 65 and over was currently in the workforce for a combination of paycheck and meeting connection, all the reasons that any of us go to work. And we also know that across the country, 250,000 people age 85 and over were in the workforce. So, it's like kind of policies in our language have not kept up with the reality of what's going on.
Well, and it also, it has this cascading effect. So if there's this bias in the head that is saying, okay, 65 years old is when somebody wants to retire,
right.
then a recruiter can look at that and say, okay, well, that's
right.
the shelf life. So if you're 55
right.
years old, they're in the back of their mind, they're saying, well, you've got maybe 10 years left, or if you're 60, you've got 5
right.
years left before
right.
you're going to want to leave.
Right.
And it's just this cascading bias that happens right at that point.
So can I say one more thing about that? I'm so glad you raised that, Andrew. So we, at some point, because we were here as we started talking about age-friendly workplace, and Karen and a team of volunteers going out, talking to chambers about the benefits of older workers, why they should consider older workers. And actually right before the COVID-19, and we had to stop those presentations, we had got to the point where every time Karen and the team did a presentation, someone, usually a few people, would raise their hand and say, so where do we find these older workers, right? So feeling like that campaign was getting traction. But early on, what we heard was exactly what you're saying. People aren't going to stay around that long. So we pulled together all the research. And here's the reality. On average, older workers stay on the job 4 times longer than younger workers do. Now, that's not because younger workers are bad, but all the things that happen to us when we're younger, we get married, we move, we go on to graduate school. We're more focused on what's that next promotion than we are as older workers. So older workers actually have 4 times longevity and tenure on the job. So that's another myth, everybody listening, we need to defeat.
Yeah, and I will tell you, from the work that I do, it used to be a big red flag if you were considered to be a job hopper.
Yeah.
And this is just my theory in defense of the younger workers, is that entry-level salaries are still coming in at between $35,000 and $50,000.
Yeah.
And that was how much I would expect when I graduated from college, some 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But I don't have the straddling debt of college that
right.
the ones have today.
Right.
The costs of housing, the costs of healthcare, and plus all of just the kind of digital stuff that, subscriptions to the internet and subscriptions to cell phones and all of that.
Right.
Never had any of that. And so I don't think, younger workers are necessarily, they're leaving jobs to get more experience, but I think it's it used to be this point where, you got to pay your dues before you can move up. And now I think it's just more they want to pay their rent.
Yeah.
And
no, I totally get it. I have 2 millennial age daughters. Fortunately, they both, have terrific jobs. They work really hard. But all of that is real. It's real.
But age discrimination is real too. I mean, it's not a myth. It's not urban legend. I mean, ageism happens. There's in very concrete ways it happens. There's laws that, obviously try to do their best to prevent it. But,
right.
Diversity in the workplace over the years has proven to be good for business. I mean, diversity in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of disability.
Right.
We don't think about diversity as it relates to age, and we should, right? I mean, you talk a lot about the intergenerational workforce and why it makes sense for business. Can you talk a little bit about that?
You bet. So 2 things. Ageism is real. So if anybody is here and has experienced ageism, you are not alone. A study by the Urban Institute and ProPublica that was released a little over a year ago showed that 56% of people who had entered their 50s with stable employment, meaning they had been salary job employed for at least 5 years, were either pushed out or laid off. So it's real, right? And that's one of the things that we're trying to counter. So one of the things that we know is AARP did a study, and of the companies that have diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, only 8% of them include age, right? So we pulled together the research on what are the benefits of having age integrated, of that diversity in the workplace that you're talking about, Andrew. And what we discovered was this, that for whether it's a for-profit, government, or a not-for-profit, here are some of the benefits. There's more team problem solving. There's more creativity. There's more opportunity for that reciprocal mentorship where people can learn from each other. There's more transfer of understanding of an industry. But most important, I think, to the bottom line, certainly, of for-profit companies, intergenerational teams are more productive and more profitable than companies that simply kind of rely on one generation of any generation. So promoting generations working together, that does not mean generations that are just sitting in cubicles without interaction. The companies that are really successful are those that deliberately try to foster that intergenerational relationship. But yeah, it's the business. The business case for hiring older workers is, one, having the benefits of intergenerational, but the other parts of the business case for hiring older workers is, contrary to some of the stereotypes, we know that older workers actually love learning new things, have a certain degree of resilience. Somebody, an industry leader who I talked to this week, called it grit. And she said if she was starting a business in the post-COVID-19 economy, she would staff it primarily with older workers because we've been through stuff before. You know, we've been through the post-September 11th and the changes that had to be made there. We've been through the Great Recession and had to figure out, you know, how do you keep business going then? So a lot of benefits that older workers bring, again, not to the exclusion of younger workers, but intergenerational teams actually are the best.
So let me bring up a conflict in terms of how America addresses ageism.
Mm-hmm.
Almost half of our U.S. senators are over the age of 65. 147 U.S. reps over the age of 65.
Yeah.
Our president, Joe Biden, they're in their 70s. Bernie Sanders is in his 80s, but he had a tremendous following of young Americans.
Right.
Here's another interesting thing. A third of the members of Congress who are 65 and older represent districts that are on average below the age of 35.
Right.
And in addition, the average age of a CEO that they're hiring, in 2005, it was 45, and today it's 58 years old. What does this say about us in terms of, we trust our leaders who are older, but we also consider the average American of that age beyond their prime? I mean, is this just a business decision?
So I'm going to try not to be overtly political here. And Andrew, you've known me long enough that that's going to be really challenging. So one of the things that I'm going to say with regard to political leadership is, I think for the most part, that speaks more to the value of incumbency than it does. And I would suggest that, you know, again, having intergenerational would be really, really useful. One of the things that I found really interesting in the Democratic primary campaign was how ageism kept coming up in this way. People saying, love Mayor Pete, but he's too young. Right. Love Bernie, but he's too old, right? So you're too young, too old. And I kept thinking, is there an exactly the right age the right age to be the Democratic candidate? We know how that played out. We know that you can't be the right gender, or you have to be the right gender to be a Democratic candidate. That's an aside. But I found it interesting. So I think, I mean, to me, in political leadership, I view it more as the value of incumbency in those high-level positions. I look at the representation that I have in my own state legislative area in Northwest Denver. Serena Gonzalez Gutierrez, Julie Gonzalez. So, clearly a district that is willing. So I think that there's an opportunity for younger leadership, and I think it's really important to have a balance of younger and older. So I'm not sure it goes to an area of trust more than it does. It's really hard to get someone out of the Senate.
Well, and Anthony Fauci is in his 80s,
right?
And that's somebody who.
And we want him to stay.
Yeah.
Along with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it's like, yeah.
And there's part of that, though, that is, the narrative is that there's wisdom, there's maturity, there's
Right,
all of these things that,
right,
is we trust in that. But
right,
when it comes to average Americans who are over the age of
right.
55, it's like, no, that wisdom, that maturity, that experience
Right.
is just not valued as much.
Right. No, and Andrew, and you're exactly right. And that's literally why we're doing this with changing the narrative. And really, we wish it would take off, kind of around the country, that what we're doing in Colorado to elevate the discussion about the value that older people bring to teams, to community. And I'll give you some examples. So and a lot of this is, I've been doing a lot of thinking, as have we all, what happens post COVID-19, right? So I've never thought it was a good idea to simply say, I'm older and I have experience, because it's like, so what, you're too old, you're going to be too expensive, right? But I think if all of us, and I think all of this has got to happen on 3 levels, right? So one, what do we do as older adults or simply caring community members to talk about the value of ourselves as older workers? How do we broadly, and that's where changing the narrative weighs in, how do we talk to employers about this and make sure they're getting the message? And one of the things that I really took heart in was that before COVID-19 stopped us, our kind of road trips out to businesses and chambers to talk about the value, that people were getting it and people were saying, yes, we do think older workers are valuable. And the third is we need some policy prescriptions, and we can talk about that later. But if we think about some certain examples right now of where that Dr. Fauci kind of experience would be really useful. So think of things that companies are going to have to do, right, coming out of post-COVID-19. And let's say you're an accountant. Now, anybody who's been trained in accounting can do accounting, but somebody has had the experience of 30 years and going through post-September 11th and going through the Great Recession can probably go to a company and say, I can help you manage cash flow and relationships with vendors so we can get through this. A teacher who maybe has 25 years of experience, and maybe she's been teaching 6th grade, but can say, all of us are going to have to move online, and we're going to have to do a lot of our communication and training online. I herded cats in 6th graders. I know how to make education interesting. So we're not just having, kind of like boring webinars, and I can make it really interesting. So what do we do? I think of, kind of the team at JVA who in 2000, 2008, that grant writing team got JVA's clients all kinds of the federal American Recovery Dollar because they were experienced grant writers. So, and now they're even more experienced. So to me, it's not simply saying I'm older, I'm experienced. It's like, how do you position as individuals, how do we position that experience within what the challenges are that organizations are going to have to solve coming out of the post-COVID-19?
And to your point, combining that with this intergenerational thing of, the younger workers who might have the digital experience that is important, as well as the maturity and the experience that older workers have in terms of going through those types of things as well.
Right.
What is your message to employers? I mean, I don't think employers go out every day and say, oh, you know what, today we're going to be biased against older workers.
Yeah.
It's unintentional. I mean,
some do. No. So I think it's a combination of explicit bias and implicit bias and things that people don't even realize. So for example, how does ageism play out, right, in hiring? I realize that we haven't actually defined ageism and what ageism is. So for those, and we found out our first year of starting it, it was really important to define it because a lot of people may be aware of racism, sexism, but they don't know what ageism means. So ageism is basically prejudice, stereotypes, discrimination against people based on their age. It can be directed against younger people as well. So if any of you are running around saying things like entitled millennial or calling people snowflakes, just stop. But directed, here's how it plays out. And I think some of it may be intentional, but some of it is just implicit bias that we don't even know we have. So prejudice in hiring, prejudice might sound like, I don't really want to hire older people because it's going to be like having my mom around the office. Stereotyping are things like saying, older people, they're just not good with technology. So I'm going to make the assumption that this person applying doesn't have the skill instead of actually doing a skills-based assessment, right? Which would let you know whether the person has the skill or not. Outright discrimination is this thing that I found out about shortly after starting changing the narrative, that people are asking for high school graduation dates on online job applications. I've been in the privileged position of literally not ever really having to apply for jobs. So I was like, really, that's a thing? Went online to fill out an application for a job I had no interest. I think it was like some delivery driver. And it literally asked for high school graduation date. My high school graduation year wasn't on it. So, simple ways to screen people out. And we need to think about the fact that it is against the law to go ahead and discriminate based on age, but it is not yet against the law. And I would love to see this become illegal to ask people's high school graduation date, which are approx for age. In the workplace, it kind of plays out by not being given opportunities for professional development. So we know that happens a lot. Employers will say, oh, somebody doesn't have the skill, but here's the staff development that we're doing on our brand new software we're using. And by the way, you haven't been invited. So, so again, when we think about what we need to do things on a policy level. And I can talk a little bit about that if you like.
And I think it's training too. I mean, it's obviously, the company itself has to be very implicit. I see it in the job posting. So I see the language issue come up, tech savviness, or here's another favorite one, digital native, which basically means that you were born in an age when digital was everything.
Exactly.
Money is obviously something that people screen for. They think, I used to think very naively, well, a company's going to get what they pay for. So, if they think that they're going to get somebody to work in that job for half the price of somebody who can actually do the job well, then they're crazy. But it's not. That's what they do. The one that I like, and it's this is not a slam or a judgment against younger professionals whatsoever. Because, I also train younger graduates and entry-level professionals about job seeking as well. And there's certain things that they have to deal with at all. But the language recent graduates is, experience ranges, companies illegally discouraging older candidates by putting a cap on experience. And then the one that has been really prevalent, and this is very intentional, is ad targeting. Where they're going to Facebook and they're going to using Google ads, and they're targeting people of a certain age. Now, the other thing is, and you said this, but the age discrimination is actually defined by the government. I mean, the ADEA is it's forbidding age discrimination for people over the age of 40, and it's not just for hiring; it's also for employees who are being discriminated for anyway. Now, talk a little bit about that. And folks, I know we're going to be talking a lot more in a minute about the practical applications of applying for jobs.
I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in the chat. Yeah,
we are going to get to that. But is someone who actually files a discrimination claim, my experience is that's a very difficult thing to do, and it's difficult to prove.
So it's very difficult to, you can file a discrimination complaint based on age with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. In Colorado, if you're working in a smaller company, you can file a complaint with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. They're very difficult to prove, and part of it is a result of a Supreme Court decision that put a different burden of proof on age discrimination than it does on race and gender discrimination. So for age discrimination right now, you have to prove that it is the primary reason, as opposed to race and gender, where it can be a contributing. So that's kind of one of the things. There was a recent Supreme Court decision that said that's not the case if it was kind of a federal government job, but for most of us, it's very hard to prove. Because any smart employer is not going to look at me and say, well, Janine, I'm firing you because you're older. And so it's hard for me to come up with the proof. Having said that, policy solutions, there is, a potential law that has been in Congress for a long time. The acronym is POWDER, Protecting Older Workers Against Discrimination Act, that would kind of sharpen up those inconsistencies. So I think that's people who care about this issue ought to be advocating with their elected officials to get that moving. And yeah, so the law, it's very hard. It's very hard
to do. Yeah.
It's hard to do.
So let's talk about job seeking specifically. So I hear from job seekers, they're afraid to represent on their resumes that they're over the age of 50. And in addition, and instead of celebrating their accomplishments, their promotions, their job titles, that trajectory, their education, they're afraid that those things are going to be intimidating to a recruiter or a hiring manager. And I understand that. It's sad, but it's real. What's the best advice you offer to older job seekers?
Right. So I think that, there are two answers, and I realize I didn't fully answer something that you asked before. What are we telling employers? We're telling employers that they ought to be training all managers in implicit bias. And because one of the things that we know is that if managers have been trained in implicit bias, it makes them less likely to act on it, right? And then we need policy solutions around the language, around digital natives. I mean, I view as digital natives as a thing, and all of us were digital pioneers. We had to figure out not only how to develop it and how to use it, right? So I think we need to make that case. I think I've always thought the idea of like shaving years off your resume, and you're the resume expert, Andrew, so I would defer to you on this. Kind of, if you're trying to hide your age, at some point, you're going to show up. And I think, so I'm not sure that that's like really useful. Here's how, though, I know that it works to get you in the door. So a colleague of ours, a longtime volunteer with Changing the Narrative, got a college degree relatively late in life, superb marketer, applied for a marketing job, and people looked at her college graduation date and assumed she was a lot younger. She got to the interview stage and she was able to make the argument. Would I suggest lying? No. But I say that to know it's real. My advice, and Linda Sollers, who did a seminar for you, I think a week ago, I think is tremendous on this. It's focusing as opposed to just chronological resume, it's really focusing on what can you do to solve that employer's current challenges. And so the kind of things I was talking about before, like, if you're an accountant, not just here are my accounting jobs, but here is how I helped this company through this really difficult time during the recession, and we came out of it wonderfully. If you are a fundraiser, here is how during the Great Recession, I raised $1 million for this client. It's being really specific about how, and focused on the accomplishments you have and how they're going to be a benefit right now. Because essentially we're reinventing everything. So I also feel like a lot of the rules that we talked about, that we might have talked about if we were doing this workshop back in January, are probably all going to change. World Economic Forum published an article today saying that the two main characteristics that companies were going to need coming out of this were resilience and agility. And we know, and all the research shows, older people, we get more resilient. And so we can't just obviously send a resume that says, hey, by the way, I'm older and I'm resilient, but we can give examples and point out. I think it's going to require a lot more drilling down, not just, job titles and typical accomplishments, but specifically how we were able to demonstrate that resilience and help business owners solve their problems.
Yeah, I'll give some advice on this as well, because I've seen that come through the group chat. Going with the baseline that ageism is real, and going with what we know is that recruiters are looking at a resume, and typically, this isn't just for older job seekers, they're looking at your most recent experience,
right,
to make a decision, and your most recent skills.
Right.
So from a recruiter's perspective, a hiring perspective, usually anything 10 to 15 years old is irrelevant, unless you're trying to change your career, if there's something that is very specific. Right. Now, I'm talking in very generalist terms. A lot of this is case by case, depending on per person.
Right.
But if you can not list anything more than 15 to 20 years old on your resume, that's one way. The other thing is about language.
Mm-hmm.
If I know you're proud that you have more than 25 years experience at doing something,
Right.
but that's an immediate key to somebody that you're an older job seeker.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in resumes themselves, I tell people all the time that even the most well-written resume, you only get about 50 to 60% of who that person is.
Mm-hmm.
So, recruiters are looking for that rational, logical reason as to why you should get into the interview pile. And if age is one of those reasons in their mind, you don't want to hide it, but you don't want to promote it either. So instead of saying 20 years experience, just drop that right away. Also from your LinkedIn profiles as well.
Right.
One of the best things an older candidate can do is to appear young, is to know how to edit their experience. It's no longer seen as a bad thing to not list all of your jobs throughout your lifetime. It's okay to just go back 15 years and to concentrate on the skills that they're asking for. Which brings me to the point that you just brought up, which is focusing in on specificity. Unless a job listing says otherwise, interpret that job posting. There's 4 or 5 things in that job posting that you are going to want to understand that they are looking for in terms of the skills, in terms of the problems that you're trying to solve and the experience that they need, and tying that into your resume.
Right.
Resume formats today are, they're almost scientific in the sense of, we know how information is organized so that people are looking at information and making quick decisions about you. We know how they are set out so that your keywords and phrases are getting through these, pardon my French, goddamn applicant tracking systems, which is basically a computer ranking you. It's not a human being, it's a computer getting you to the top of the pile. The key is to get into the interview, and anything that's on your resume that you think is going to not help you get into that job interview, adapt as will. And I hate to say this because I used to think to myself, well, no, you know what? I mean, if they're not going to interview you or hire you because they're practicing ageism, well, you don't want to work for that company anyway. But I think some of this it's unintentional. Some of it is very intentional, but we deal with the cards that we're dealt, and we play with the cards that we're dealt here. The other thing is staying current. I mean, your years of experience is obviously going to be really great to a company, but not all of the experience you have is going to be relevant, or it's not going to equate you to being the most qualified. If you need to go back to some trade schools, universities, community colleges, and learn a new technical skill, that's relatively easy to do. I mean, to be able to go out and do that. The other thing is it's in our mind sometimes. We think, oh my gosh, I'm over, I have over experience. I don't have enough experience. I don't have this, I don't have that. And we come up with these definitions of what we're not, as opposed to looking in the mirror every day and reminding ourselves of who we are and being proud of that and confident of it and being able to talk about ourselves that way and being able to create that. And I hate this marketing speak, but this brand promise of what we have to offer. So I'll get off my soapbox for a minute.
No, I think that's a great soapbox, and you are the resume expert. And the other thing I would advise is, and Andrew, I can send it to you, and if you want to get it out to people on your list. So there are companies that actually want older workers. So I always think a really good thing is to kind of look at the job, specifically the job boards, after you've looked at Andrew Hudson's job list, of course, but look at the job boards of people who are specifically recruiting older workers. So there's something called retirement jobs. There's something, there are a couple, Karen Brown actually put them together, and we've got a resource guide on that. So looking for that. In Colorado, we had just launched, Changing the Narrative had just launched the Certified Age-Friendly Employer. And those are employers who actually are raising their hand and they're saying, we want those 50-plus workers. So I can send links to the website as well of the Age-Friendly Foundation that has a list of those. AARP has a pledge program of organizations that actually want older workers and want to encourage. So all of those, part of it is how do you position yourself for any job, and part of it is kind of look at the people who actually value that wisdom and experience and insight that older workers bring. And I'll share those with you, Andrew, if you can get them out to everyone.
Yeah, and the other thing that I hear a lot from is, and I think Liz Ryan talked about this a little bit, as maybe Linda did as well, is this idea of the gig economy. And older workers in particular are really positioned well to use their skills and backgrounds to become consultants, to become working on specific projects. I found that older workers have a broader network of connections in terms of people in their industries, former bosses, colleagues, vendors, clients, anybody that you have worked with in the past that has ever said to you, if you're ever looking for something to do, if you ever have a opportunity to come work for us, a retainer contract, a project contract, any of that stuff, it's easy enough to set yourself up as an S corp, or a C corp even, to get to get yourself right tax wise. When I first became an entrepreneur, it was very intimidating, and actually after I did it, I looked at myself and said, what was the big deal? It's not that hard. But that's another option. And I think for older job seekers in particular, you bring so much talent, and consulting and doing project work is very, very valid, and it's used a lot.
I think that's going to be increasingly important too, because one, we already know that the economy was going in the direction, more of the gig economy. So I think all of us are, and there were efforts in Colorado to look at what does the future of work look like. So we already know the future of work was becoming more gig-like. We know that the future of work was becoming more around flexible, remote. One of the job boards we'll send information about is specifically those that offer flex part-time remote work. So, often as we get older, that is appealing. So it's kind of like looking at specifically what are those sources that are looking for the kind of things that we have to offer, and not necessarily getting locked into, we need to look for traditional work the way it always looked like when we entered the workforce.
Yeah, here's another question, and this is something that I find, unfortunately, it's becoming more and more equal, but it's definitely weighted to women. Is how do you get back into the workforce after you've been a stay-at-home parent? And I'm just curious. I'm sure you've been asked that or addressed that as well.
Yeah. Well, that was actually one of the things that we did at JVA, was we tended to hire women who were coming out of the workforce, because that was also kind of my story, although I was out of the workforce for a short time. But I realized that there were very few opportunities for women, and especially opportunities for women that allowed you to work flexibly, that allowed you to work part-time and still use your professional skills. I think it's the same strategy. It's the same strategy that you've outlined in your resume. It's like figuring out, so I think everybody should, whatever webinars you've done, Andrew, on resume should be step one for everybody. I think step two for everybody ought to be, I can't imagine somebody's ringing my doorbell, but they are.
Not mine either. I think so. If everyone could just hit their mute button, that'd be great. Thanks.
So I think it's, really watching, what Linda Sollers put together, and really kind of focusing on kind of what your strengths are. But then I'm going to keep going back, look at the upcoming business challenges that people are going to face, and figure out how you position what you have done in light of, and basically asserting, look, I've done this, and therefore I can do this for you. Here's a business problem that you want to solve. So I think the analogy, both older workers and women exiting the workforce, are very, very similar, very similar. But we've got to tie on things that we actually have done. Okay.
Yeah. There's another question that I get, and I get this quite a bit, is I'm an older job seeker, and I don't want to work at the level that I've been. I don't even care if I'm making the same money. I'm happy to take a pay cut to do something different. And I'm either financially secure, or it's just at that point where the jobs that I used to do are not available as much as they were. How do I convince an HR recruiter that I'm not going to be intimidating to a younger boss or even a less qualified boss if they hire me.
Andrew, hold on. There's a strange person in my yard.
Oh, do you want to go deal with that?
I'm going to have you start answering that.
Sure. Yeah. So the question again is, if I am trying to get a job and I don't mind taking a pay cut, I don't even mind taking a cut in responsibility, or I just want to get into the front lines again. I know when I was a VP and a manager, and a lot of that stuff, you can get burnt out doing it, and you're not actually doing the things that you were trained to do. You're in a more management leadership role, and you want to get back into that. So I think a lot of it is also, it's about the language, and it's about the conversations and being prepared, anticipating the kinds of questions that you're going to get from a recruiter that might address that, or even addressing it up front. There's two things that I've heard from recruiters. They say in those situations that, number one, they're afraid to put somebody who is more qualified in a position that their boss might not be as qualified or as old, and then that might not be said out loud. And then the second thing is that people who say that they're willing to take a pay cut are going to leave that position the minute they find a job that is more in line with what they believe they're worth. And be prepared to answer questions surrounding that, or even address those questions up front, because those are legitimate issues that a recruiter is thinking about. And it's whether or not it's fair for them to address those issues, it's reality, and it's something that you should think about in terms of how you might answer those questions.
And Andrew, I've just decided to be brave and let this person roam around in my yard. So if all of a sudden you hear me screaming, you'll know what happened. There are two things I want to add to that. I've talked to a couple of business owners who have said this. When someone who is in that position basically puts it out affirmatively, doesn't wait for the question, but puts it out affirmatively, they've gone ahead with them. So there was one business owner I talked to who said, somebody basically described the situation that you've just described, Andrew, of, look, I'm kind of okay financially, but it is really important for me to be able to contribute, to be part of the team, blah, 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 and ended up being hired as a project manager to kind of hire a team of people. I had that experience myself as a business owner when someone who had like 30 years of journalism experience, and then kind of the journalism industry kind of collapsed, and said, hey, look, I'm fine. My wife's a judge. I'm fine, but I got to get out. He basically, his email to me said, I got to get out of the house. And so we chatted with him, and he ended up doing a bunch of projects for us, highly successful. Yeah. But he, at the outset, didn't wait for the questions, didn't wait for all of the concerns, just said, look, here's how I think I can help you. I'm not going to be the person who, turns around and asks for more money. So I think being upfront about it is a good strategy.
And this is something else that we really haven't talked about a lot, but it's an important part of this, is the networking issue.
Right.
Because all it takes is one person
to
think outside the box and say, okay, I get that. I understand why you would be good for this job. It just takes one person.
Right.
And it's, it really is us making the argument. It's not just a recruiter trying to match skills
exactly
to the resume. It's you making the argument and making the case. And not only in terms of people that you might not have met, but also your networks, those level of contacts, so that you can get them in reshaping the narrative about you and about what you're trying to do as well. But networking is such a big deal. I mean, I will tell you, if you're spending all of your time just sending out resumes blindly on job boards, mine included, there is you're going to get stuck in what I call the job-seeking quicksand very, very quickly.
And Andrew, I also think that's a benefit that older people have. I mean, one of the things that we know is as we get older, we have more connections. There's a reason that you could put together this series like, in a snap of a finger, because you know so many people. So you can pick up the phone and say, hey, would you do this, 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 and this? And as we get older, by definition, we've encountered more people, we know more people. So not only does it play out in experience, but it also plays out in the number of people that we can ask, to help us, to reciprocate, et cetera.
Yeah, and one of the things I really liked about Linda the other day is she talked about keeping a diary, a journal.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is also just about writing. And, write out a job description in your own words, what it is that you want to do and what it is that makes sense and what are the values that are important to you in terms of the job that you want. And all of this stuff, I will send out to everybody here who didn't see Linda's resume. She has a wonderful, wonderful document that she put together, as well as a link to a free strengths test. It's kind of a strengths finder test, but it's a little bit different that a university has put out, and it's free to takers. But it's about language, and it's about how to translate value proposition words into business speak. So if honesty is a value of yours, well, in business speak, it's about ethics, it's about integrity. There's other words that you can use to help describe that. But there's a lot of different ways to do that. But there is a lot of work and a lot of self-introspection that goes with this. And I think particularly, in the challenges that older job seekers are finding.
Right. And I think the beauty, and again, I want to encourage everybody to look at Linda's, I've had the opportunity to work with Linda a number of times, and especially if you're feeling beat up. So one of the things that I know is we've gone around the state and we've done workshops. Whenever we talked about ageism, somebody would say, that's happening to me and I'm starting to feel really, really bad. So I think just listening to Linda and recognizing the strengths that you have is really empowering. And so highly, highly encourage that. But then you've got to kind of translate it into your own experience. And she's really good at having people, and one of my daughters actually had worked with her. So I think she's good for people of any age, but she is really good at helping you translate strengths into actual statements that you can make to employers, which give you some confidence, because it is hard. And the other thing is, get together with other people in practice. I haven't found it useful when people get together and complain about ageism, because then we're not coming up with solutions, but to get together and say, we got this, we can do this.
Yeah, and I'll tell you the other thing related to that. I mean, from a branding and marketing standpoint, I look at all of this as a branding and marketing exercise. So, the first idea is to sit down and answer the question, what do you want to do? Even before you start working on your resume, and having some focus about what it is that you want to do and all of the stuff that goes through that in terms of your accomplishments and your experiences and the skills and everything that go with that. And then translating that onto a resume. I highly recommend, having a professional resume writer work with you. And you can do that free through the Colorado Workforce Centers. There are professional organizations. Just as a small pitch, I'm doing my $99 resume tune-up, which I'll do through May. And you can just go to my website, andrewhudsonsjobslist.com, if you want some help with that. My experience is I have found that most resumes have great information. It's just about how it's organized and how it's formatted that makes it a powerful document. But on that document is where you start really with the brand statement, the brand promise, who you are, and then translating that to every other touch point in your job search. So whether it's your cover letters, your LinkedIn profiles, the conversations that you're having, the cold calls, and obviously the interviews itself. Now, I will tell you, one of the areas that I was really excited about this past Monday is I had Deborah Fine, who wrote The Small Art of Finding.
She's great.
And she talked a lot about, it takes people out of their comfort zones to talk about themselves. It really does. I mean, it's like, that question, that big, hairy, scary question, tell me about yourself. People freak out. They don't know where to start, what to say. And I look at it as an opportunity, an opportunity for you to take control of that interview and really direct where you want it to go. But Deborah Fine has some great techniques, just even, about interviewing, but also just about letting people know that you're out there and you're looking for new opportunities. So I would highly recommend her as well. And again, I'll send a follow-up email to everyone who is here to put that link to all those YouTube seminars as well.
Right.
Our hour is winding down. Is there anything else you want to share? I mean, we could talk about this for 4 hours straight and probably not
I
hit
think I guess I want to conclude. So ageism is real. We know that. What we're trying to do at changing the narrative is change the way employers look at older workers. And we are not under the delusion that it's going to happen like this. But I will say, every time we have been able to talk to chambers, talk to employers, we have people who start getting it and say yes. So what we all collectively need to do is what we collectively need to do is this. We need to, among ourselves, and I want to just end with kind of the 3 levels we need to take action. As individuals, we need to make sure, and Andrew, you referred to this, that we're positioned, that we're staying current. Like everybody, when I think of what's going to happen post-COVID-19 in any company, everybody's got to be proficient in Zoom and go to webinar and that kind of thing. So we can use this time to make sure that we're gaining all the skills there, making sure that we are proficient in any kind of online communication tools, whether it's Slack or Asana, whatever it is, but making sure that we've developed that proficiency. So we're not the person showing up and saying, oh, I don't know how to use that. So I think that's for us. And we need to stop the self-deprecating talk. Nobody out here should be saying, I'm having a senior moment. I don't know if I'm ready to learn that, whatever. That's the action as individuals we need to take. On a policy level, I know our team, we're going to continue to advocate for policies that are more favorable to older adults, including things like stronger age discrimination laws, including things like making sure that workforce development centers across the state are devoting money and program time to upskilling older workers. So we all have to continually relearn. And then generally narrative, making sure as we're talking to anyone that we are not reinforcing ageist stereotypes. So we all have a part to play in this. And and thank you all for being here. Andrew, thank you for doing this amazing series. This really, I'm honored to be here, and thank you.
Well, the information you shared and your perspective and your expertise has just been wonderful, and I appreciate you being here as well. Just a couple of housekeeping things. I will be sending out a follow-up email to everybody who is on here, and I'll include Linda Soller's document as well as the links to the other seminars on my YouTube page. Somebody posted it early. And if you have other questions, don't hesitate to email me, text me. My email address is ahudson@ahjobslist.com. You can call me or you can text me. I'm at 720-289-5877. I'm happy to do whatever I can to help in your journey of finding your next chapter and your next job. And also send me some ideas about who else you would like to see as part of these seminars, or the topics that you'd like to see as it relates to these seminars. I'm going to start putting a new schedule of these together. I appreciate everyone's support. And, lastly, I know this is terrifying times. This is, we're going through so much. And hopefully these seminars are providing this overwhelming sense of anxiety about job search to be a little bit more manageable, and recognizing that maybe some of the issues that you're dealing with personally in your job search are actually pretty common. And, we are here to help try and relate to that, but also offer some common sense strategies and some solutions, some tested solutions to how you can overcome those issues as well. So, stay strong. We are a resilient country, resilient people. I'm by nature very optimistic, and I think we're going to be just fine. So hang in there, and thanks again for being part of this, and talk to you later, Janine.
Thanks, everyone.